If you enjoyed the channel and our video content and would like to support us, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can sign up to our Patreon site, which is a monthly subscription to one of our 4 tiers, each giving you something different from early access interviews up to exclusive unseen footage. There's also the option of a one-off donation via PayPal, which allows you the option to donate an amount of your choice. Both options really help to keep this channel going and to continue putting out regular content for you good folk. So please take a look at aircrewinterview.tv/donate, and I thank you in advance. Thank you and enjoy. So Simon, when did you first become interested in aviation?
I've always been interested in aviation since I was a child. My father had an interest in it, and he was a flying instructor and had aeroplanes, so I was always around aeroplanes since I was about the age of about 6-7 years old.
Good stuff. So when did you join the Royal Navy and why did you choose the Navy?
So I joined the Royal Navy in January 2002. The reason I chose the Navy was when I was at school back home in Belfast. I was in the Combined Cadet Forces in the RAF section, and one afternoon after school the Navy recruiter came around, a guy called Martin Quinn, and he showed us a video about the Fleet Air Arm. And I didn't really know much about the Fleet Air Arm at the time, and I'd been predominantly sort of focused on maybe joining the Air Force. And the video he showed just looked really interesting, exciting, you know, travelling the world, flying off, you know, Royal Navy warships, and doing all sorts of interesting flying like that. And I thought, well, you know, the guys that I went to school with, you know, a lot of them are going to go off and be lawyers and do all that sort of stuff, and you know, they wouldn't apply to one law firm. So I thought, well, you know, I want to be a military pilot. I'm not just going to bet all my horses on, you know, joining the Air Force. So I thought I'll put an application into the Navy and the Air Force at the same time.
So did you always want to join the helicopter force?
And no, I originally wanted to fly jets when I joined the Navy, but you know, flying jets is you know, pretty hard to get through all the courses and all of that sort of stuff. So whenever I finished my elementary flying training at Barkston Heath, I got streamed onto rotary wing and then went to Shawbury. So you know, my career path was set to be a helicopter pilot from that point on.
So can you talk us through some of your basic training in the aircraft you started on?
Yeah, so I started not too far from where we are today, up at RAF Cranwell back in around April 2003, and to do ground school, and then went over to Barkston Heath, and then spent 6 months at Barkston Heath flying the Slingsby Firefly, and in those days it was the T67 M260, which 260 horsepower, quite powerful, quite a fun training aircraft to fly. My course officer back in those days was Al Wade, so a lot of people in the military flying community and airshow community will know of Al, who sadly passed away a few years ago, but he was a, you know, incredible guy and an incredible instructor, so I was very lucky to get to fly with him a few times.
And on this basic training course, was it just Navy guys or was it a mix of everyone in there?
So when I went through, it started out as the Joint Elementary Flying Training School, and then became DEFTS, which was Defence Elementary Flying Training School while I was there, and it was split into Army and Navy squadrons. So whilst we all, you know, Army and Navy guys at Barkston Heath shared the crew room, we were doing slightly different courses, and you know, the Navy guys flew the T67 M260, whereas the Army guys in those days flew the T67 M160. So there's, you know, difference in the courses. They didn't do things like aerobatics and formation flying, I think.
And did you know what type you wanted to go on to during the training?
During training, I didn't really have a particular focus. I thought I'd either like to fly the Lynx or you know, join the Commando Helicopter Force and fly the Sea King 4 in the Commando role. Those were the two things I'd sort of had an idea that I'd like to do.
So let's talk about the Lynx. What were your first thoughts on the aircraft?
My first thoughts of the Lynx is that it's a very sporty looking helicopter, and it's, you know, quick. You know, it still holds the world speed record for a helicopter, for a true helicopter to this day, which was set in August 1986. yeah, so I've always thought it's a great, looking helicopter, and it's an absolute sports car in helicopter terms. So the role of the Lynx, as far as the Royal Navy's been concerned, has always been anti-surface unit warfare, or ASUW, with a small u, as we tend to refer to it in the Navy, and that's basically going out, building up a surface picture with the radar, out at sea, what we call the recognised maritime picture, looking where all the vessels are, the pattern of life, all that sort of stuff, and then looking for hostile vessels and things like that. So if you were at war, you would then be hunting those vessels down, targeting them, marking them, and then potentially engaging them with missile systems. So that was a primary role for ASUW. It also, the Lynx is fairly unique in that it's quite a multi-role helicopter. So it has other roles like anti-submarine warfare, and for the Royal Navy that means carrying torpedoes and depth charges. So it's got no ability to find a submerged submarine. It needs to be directed by an anti-submarine helicopter like a Merlin or a Sea King, or be directed by a frigate that's got its sonar and in contact with the hostile submarine, and then the Lynx would basically drive itself to the waypoint that or follow instructions from the helicopter or the other helicopter or the other ship to a weapon release point, and then either drop a depth charge or a torpedo in the water.
So can you talk us through some of your ground training on the Lynx?
So ground training on the Lynx when I went through was about 6 weeks of ground school at the engineering training school at Yeovilton. So it was delivered by engineers, and we learnt all facets of the Lynx, mechanical systems, avionics systems, weapon systems, all of that sort of stuff. So it's very, very in-depth knowledge, probably actually really more than you need to know about those systems for actually flying it, but it gives you a good grounding and understanding of how the helicopter works, so that when you are flying it and things are going wrong, you have a better understanding of what might be going wrong with it, and certainly helps debrief the engineers when you get back.
Was there a sim in your time?
Yes, there's always been a sim. So when I first started Lynx flying, I started out on the Mark III Lynx, or the HAS 3, and that simulator was a fairly old school simulator. It had cathode ray tubes for screens in front of it, for your visuals. But the cockpit was pretty representative, and it flew pretty much like a Lynx. But compared to simulators these days, and certainly in comparison to the likes of the Wildcat simulator, it's it was a very old school simulator. But then the Lynx Mark III was a pretty old school helicopter. Even at the time when I went through in the mid-2000s.
Really?
Yeah, by a long way.
So how many actually marks of Lynx were there?
A lot of marks of Lynx. For the RN, they started out with the Mark II or HAS 2. That got upgraded to the HAS 3, and then there's different variants within the HAS 3. And then they upgraded it to the Mark 8. And again, there was 2 or 3 different variants of the Mark 8 over its life as it got various updates and different avionics fits. But the 3 sort of baseline models that the Royal Navy had at the time were the Mark II in the early 80s. So that's Falklands, and then you're talking Mark III, Gulf War, and then sort of mid 90s onwards Mark 8. But the Mark III operated on the front line until I think about 2010, and it still operated as a training aircraft until 2013 with the Royal Navy.
Oh, wow.
So that's when they retired the last Mark IIIs. But the technology in it was pretty much 1960s, 1970s technology.
Yeah. So can you remember your first flight in the Lynx?
Yeah, I remember it well. It was with a guy called Mark Baines, who was a reservist instructor at the time, and it was just a familiarisation trip from Yeovilton down to our relief landing ground at Merrifield in Somerset, and just showing me some of the things that it could do, effects of controls. So I remember it pretty well. I remember it being a very demanding aircraft to fly initially, because it's got very, very responsive controls, and when you come from other helicopters that have got less responsive controls, it's very easy to over control on it. And when you're gaining experience on it.
So let's talk about your flying training. What would you be conducting during this phase, and what was it like to hover? Did that take a bit of getting used to?
So yeah, I remember the first time I hovered the Lynx, and I've seen it subsequently with all the students that I've taught over the years when they come from something like the Squirrel or Juno,
Yeah.
Jupiter, that kind of thing. They find it quite hard to hover initially because it's extremely sensitive and responsive on the controls. It's more like a high performance fixed wing aircraft in terms of its control response compared to other helicopters. So the tendency is for people to over control and have a very unsteady hover. It's not particularly difficult to hover, it's just trying to relax on the controls and trim the aircraft out and put it into a stable hover. And actually, once you've learned how to do that, the aircraft's extremely easy to hover, and you can have a very stable hover with it.
And what are the aircraft's strengths and weaknesses?
For the Lynx, the aircraft strengths, speed is one of its strengths, and its agility. Really, it's very manoeuvrable, high control power. So for a maritime aircraft, landing on a pitching, heaving deck in a high sea state, you can respond to ship movement and all of that sort of stuff as you're landing onto the deck. The other thing about the maritime variant of the Lynx is that tricycle undercarriage with the big shock absorbing oleos, so it can take a very, very heavy vertical impact, much more so than most other helicopters. And generally when seas are rough, we aim to land quite firmly, so we plant the aircraft onto the deck and make it stick to the deck, so we've got reduce the risk of it sliding off after landing. And then the other thing that sort of makes it the potent maritime capability that it is, with in terms of just its ability to operate in poor weather, is the deck lock system.
Okay.
So that's a hydraulic sort of pincer that comes out at the bottom of the aircraft fuselage, and it's operated by the pilot with a button on the collective, and it just shoots into a metal grid on the flight deck, and then closes the pincers through the holes in the grid, and then pulls the helicopter down about an inch further down on it, compressing its undercarriage, and that just stops the aircraft from sliding off the deck if the ship turns or rolls, until the point at which we can put nylon lashings on the aircraft to secure it. The weaknesses, I guess, it's always been the weakness of the Lynx is really its fuel endurance. It's never really had more than 2 hours unless you put auxiliary tanks and stuff into it. So a 2-hour endurance, and in these sort of this day and age, commanders want persistence from their aircraft, so they want their aircraft to stay airborne for a considerable amount of time, and spend more time on task, which is why we see a lot of tasks being given to unmanned air systems now, because they've got a lot of persistence. They can stay airborne for a very, very long time.
And you kind of mentioned it briefly before, but the cockpit, was it all analog, as it were, or was it any digital system?
Yeah, so the Mark III Lynx was a completely analog cockpit in terms of flying performance instruments and control instruments, and the engine gauges were all analog, gauges with needles and stuff on them. In terms of navigation system, it had a Doppler navigation system that fed a TANS, tactical air navigation computer, which is a very old school computer, and it would tend to drift quite a lot. In the late 80s, early 90s, the Mark III got fitted with a Trimble GPS, which was bolted onto the top of the instrument coaming on the observer side on the left-hand side of the cockpit. But that was completely standalone, and it was generally used to update TANS, so you could take the lat and long off that GPS and then just give TANS updates to basically drag the plot back to where the aircraft actually was, because of the the Doppler over the sea, the surface of the sea. The navigation computer would drift. When we moved on to the Mark VIII, it had a computer processor which did a lot of the navigation, which brought a lot of the systems together. The cockpit, the actual cockpit though, in terms of your performance instruments and control instruments and engine gauges, was still all analog, old school steam gauges, and it was really the mission system that got digitized. So the plot, it would be able to take information off the radar and then put it onto a tactical situational display screen, and then the observer would be able to manipulate those tracks and stuff, and the radar would tell it what course and speed a vessel would have, whereas in the Mark III that was all done manually, and manually to an extent where an observer would have a sheet of acetate. They'd put it would be the same shape as the radar screen. It would get put onto the radar screen, and then they'd start the clock and dot with a marker pen all the radar returns, take the acetate off, and then put it on a gridded plotting board that I had on their knee, plot those onto the lat and long, and then 6 minutes later dot them again, plot it, and then they with a line and a protractor then work out the distance the dots had moved, and the course that they were taking, and then do some speed times distance maths to work out the speed. So it was a very manual thing, and it really limited how many ships that you could plot at any one time, whereas the Mark VIII variant, where the computer was doing all that, meant that you could plot a lot more aircraft at any one time, and then ships at any one time. And since we've moved on, to Wildcat, that does even more of that stuff, and there's a lot more ways of manipulating the aircraft.
So, what was your first squadron, and where were you based?
The Maritime Lynx community is very small, and we've only ever really had 2 squadrons at any one time: right. A training squadron and a frontline squadron. So generally, you tend to rotate between the two. So students back in the day in the Lynx would train on 702 Squadron. And before my time, that used to be, the whole Lynx force used to be at Portland, but in 1999 they moved up to Yeovilton. So 815 and 702 Naval Air Squadrons were based at Yeovilton. So did my aircrew training, my Lynx training on 702 Naval Air Squadron. Then when I got awarded my wings, moved just a bit further down the air station to 815 Naval Air Squadron, and that's the frontline Lynx Squadron. Back in the day.
Were you ever based on the carriers or the ships? Did you ever do a stint, like a month on the carrier kind of thing?
So Lynx aircraft and Lynx flights. So the squadron gets split down into flights, which is an aircraft, 2 aircrew, although you might have an aircrew under training, augmenting the flight, and then you have 7 or 8 maintainers, plus an aircraft controller as part of the flight, and they will be attached to a small ship. Now the way that they've done it has changed on and off over the years. Between, they used to have what they called fully integrated flights, where that ship's flight would stay with a ship for a whole tour, but due to manning and equipment sort of constraints and ships all over the years, they've changed that around. So I think people tend to chop and change a little bit between ships more these days. But when I first started, it was an integrated flight. So I started out with HMS Sutherland flight from what was called my P2 time. So I was that trainee augmentee pilot. So the pilot was a flight commander, and then I went to learn a bit more about life at sea and all those sort of things that you just can't do at shore at Yeovilton. So learn how the ship's flight works at sea. So fully trained to fly the aircraft, but I don't necessarily know everything about just how it all works with the rest of the Navy and a ship. So usually that's done 6 to 9 months, and then a naval pilot or a naval observer comes back to the Squadron HQ at Yeovilton, does what they call a certificate of competence, which is a couple of weeks doing various practical flying exams, ground-based training, and written and oral examinations and stuff like that. And then on completion of that, you get awarded your certificate of competence, and then you can become like a P1 or an O1, and then you get allocated to your own flight. So for me, my first flight was HMS Sutherland flight as a P2, and I was lucky enough to go out to the Gulf and operate in the Northern Arabian Gulf on around 2006, 2007, and that was part of Optelic. In those days, it was protecting the Iraqi oil platforms. So they have 2 massive oil platforms, which basically act as they're not oil platforms, sorry, they're oil terminals. So the oil in Iraq is drilled and brought up in the country of Iraq, but they don't have much in the way of port infrastructure because of the geography of Iraq. So, and their port structure is too small for supertankers, so they pump it out through pipelines to these oil terminals at sea, and then these two oil terminals, the supertankers will dock there and then take on the oil there. But it's in quite hotly contested waters, right in the top end of the Northern Arabian Gulf. And it's very close to Iranian territorial waters, and depending on which country you are, you've got different lines that you believe to be your territorial waters, and it's all contested. So the coalition had American, Australian, British ships up there protecting those two oil platforms at the time very closely, until a point in time where the Iraqis were able to protect it themselves.
And did you work with any of the other services and maybe any other nations?
Yeah, I've worked with I've worked with the other two services, the Army and the Air Force. I worked with most NATO nations as well, either in the Gulf or out on the standing NATO maritime group, which is a big sort of NATO maritime patrol in the Mediterranean, made up of different nation ships. So you've got like Greece, Turkey, Spain, the USA, UK, Germany, all operating in that group, and they patrol the Mediterranean and carry out multinational training exercises. So a lot of anti-submarine warfare type activity and anti-surface warfare exercises around the bed. It was quite good fun.
Did you ever work with any of the fast jet guys?
In terms of Lynx operating, not really. They tend to do their own thing, and when I was at the sort of height of my Lynx career, the Royal Navy fast jet fleet had sort of the Sea Harrier had been retired. And those guys were mostly in Afghanistan. The Navy pilots that we had left, whether sent to America to do Seacorn capability on the F-18 or the Aviate-B, or they were on the Joint Harrier Force, flying the GR7s and 9s in Afghanistan and stuff. So very little contact with them. What we used to do though, we used to do fighter evasion training, once a year. So generally would go around, fly low level around Exmoor and the Bristol Channel, trying to avoid hawks and stuff like that. Basically, and we're generally quite successful because it's quite hard for a fast jet to visually beat a helicopter in a low level environment, unless it's if it's got a radar. Then they're going to find us. But generally, if you're trying to do it visually, it's pretty hard to beat a helicopter, especially with a low vis grey camouflage scheme and stuff on it.
So Simon, how many hours did you get on the Lynx? So
when I left the Lynx in 2013, I had about 1,850 or something like that when I left. And then I moved on to the Wildcat. I was trying to hang on to try and get to 2,000, but unfortunately the Navy decided the need was greater for me to go to Wildcat. And with the benefit of hindsight, I don't regret that decision. So.
Great stuff.